Hello, Universal People. I'm John Munitz.
I'm Jackie Sawicki, and welcome to the People's Podcast on the People's Basics. Today we're going to be discussing childcare, but before we get into the show, John, want to tell the listeners how they can join the home of the Universal Basics?
Sure. So we want you to subscribe and check the description section to find the links to our website and our community's Discord. We need your help in organizing for the Universal Basics, so if you like what you hear today, we hope you'll get involved. So Jackie, what are we going to be discussing on childcare?
So one of the first and most important things I'd like to discuss is family planning, deciding when, where, and how we're going to start a family. Here in Texas, there is a lot of obstruction for women choosing how, when, and where they're going to start a family, or if they decide not to start a family. So even we were going over this, outline, and it struck me how every single bullet point in our outline can be divided by rich and poor, have and have not. So even family planning is something that's very different between the haves and the have-nots. And some people don't get to choose. Some people don't have very much means by which they can start a family, or they can even choose not to start a family. So we're going to talk about the costs entailed with having kids, prepping your home, what other countries provide for their people, work and children, all kinds of stuff. So let's get into the show.
Yeah, and Jackie, on the subject of family planning, I really wanted to bring up just like a little bit of context of to the total world. Our unintended are on the fairly low side of things, with countries and continents more so like South America, as well as Africa, as well as even parts of Southeast and South Asia, tending to have a little bit higher rates than we do in the Western world in terms of unintended pregnancies. But when it compares ourselves to our European, allies, we tend to be a little bit higher on that scale and are generally around average within the OECD. It's right now a general global trend that unintended pregnancies are on the decline. Since the 1990s, we've seen roughly a rate of going from 79 per every 1,000 women of birthing basically age, going to 64 since then now today. So there's been this steady decline that we've been having more planned pregnancies than we have had in the past. And I think in large part it's an educational campaign as well as an access to some contraceptive methods so people can really choose the moments where they want to embrace parenthood. I wanted to ask you, in terms of family planning, what do you think are the needed education for people to really know if they're ready to take on that responsibility of being a parent?
There's a lot of school of thought. I personally have always said, unless you are physically, spiritually, emotionally, um, financially ready, like, hold off. But I've had friends who have kids that say, "Oh, if you wait till you're ready, it'll never happen." And so part of me is like, well, maybe then it shouldn't happen because we didn't have kids. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why we chose not to have kids. Um, but I have a lot of friends and family that have had kids, and like, there's a lot to be said about just population needing to be replenished so that we can continue civilization. And we've had that conversation, you know, um, which is fun. But really and truly, when we talk about family planning, we're talking about a woman's life for the rest of her life. Because let's be honest, and it's not as high as, maybe sensationalized in the news and stuff, but 99% or I'm sorry, 90% of single parents are single moms. So when we talk about family planning, we're talking about a woman's life for the rest of her life, because for the most part, women don't walk away from their kids 90% of the time. So what's going to happen with that woman's life from there on out? And did she have a say in choosing to become pregnant, choosing to carry it to fruition? And then does she have the educational, financial, physical, emotional, spiritual wherewithal to, you know, raise a good person from beginning to end? So a lot of times we're not talking about the like toll that it takes on people and their health and well-being. Like, it takes a lot to be a parent. So we have to
Yeah.
ask ourselves if we're really ready. And we have to be honest with ourselves and with each other, with your partner. I know a lot of people who I've known a couple people who've had kids because that's what their partner wanted, not necessarily what 100% they wanted, and vice versa. You know, people who didn't, even though they wanted to, but that's, it should be a woman's choice. I'm going to just like put that out there right there. Because again, it's her body that's going to change. She's most likely going to be the one that sticks to it all the way through. I mean, again, I'm personally a child of divorce. So my dad when I was 2 years old, um, divorced my mom. So, and so we have to ask like ourselves and each other and our partners if we really, want to do this. And so not everybody, you go back to that means thing. Not everybody has the educational or even mental knowledge or like self knowledge to ask if this is something they really want, if this is something they're really ready for. I think a lot of people have kids because that's what's expected of them. I mean, I make my mom cry when we talk about this. I'm like, it's never going to happen. And now I'm older enough that she doesn't ask anymore. But, I used to make her cry because it's just this thing, oh, you're married? Then when are you having kids? Do you have kids? I mean, I've had people ask me that. So family planning is huge in it. I don't know that we do it enough, honestly. I don't know that we ask these tough questions of ourselves and each other enough.
Yeah. It's interesting because, as you said, it does feel very much in our culture as if it is that like default option that happens when you have a couple that comes together. But when you look at it, like statistically, like what percent of adult households end up having kids? It's only 40% of adult households. So a lot of people do end up making that choice, whether that be that they didn't have a partner and therefore didn't have kids, or just having a partner and they wanted to save money, they didn't want to have kids. A lot of households are choosing to not have kids in America. And to your point before about like where does this kind of disparity in choice really occur? You're right to say that women more often are going to be the single parents of kids who live in single parent homes. It is roughly, I believe it's 80% of American children live with only their mother. There's a certain period that you have people who live with both parents trading off time. And then you have, I think it's fathers are roughly 20% of that haul. And you're going to have this kind of gap that's falling again, kind of on socioeconomic grounds, largely, as well as racial grounds, where you have groups that are generally poorer tend to have a higher frequency of single parenthood. Now, you could say, is it a chicken or the egg effect? Are people being detrimented by living in single parent homes and this kind of perpetuates poverty? Or is this poverty causing stress, which is dividing many families apart, causing single parent homes?
Yeah, don't
It's
forget about our
certainly
health
an interesting
care.
question.
Yeah,
Yeah, for certain.
mhm.
But like that rate of single parenthood, um, when you actually get down into the numbers, we see that 21% of white children are living in a single parent family. We're seeing 28% of Hispanic individuals living in a single parent household. And we're seeing 51% of Black children living in a single parent household. And so we have to understand that, where these disruptions to the kind of family unit are occurring are largely tied to a lot of these economic factors that you pointed to before. And it starts from the very first day you come into this world screaming, whether that be at home or in hospitals. The cost is not free to have a baby. It is an expensive process. And we're not exactly delivering equitable results across the board, where
Right.
infant mortality rates are sky high in communities of color, particularly Black communities, compared to the general population. It's roughly an 8-to-1 disparity in that death rate. And the cost is not justifying that by any degree, that we're doing worse than so much of the rest of the world in delivering this kind of prenatal care and, hospital delivery system. It's
Yeah,
costing roughly
people.
like $7,540 to just have a kid at a hospital right now.
Yeah, we again we have this, American exceptionalism thing, but Mexico has better child mortality rates and childbirth mortality rates than America does. So we often kind of see our neighbors to the south as less developed, but we, time and time again, when we look at these lists of where America is compared to other countries, where we have so much left to be desired. Like we have so much work to do.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you. And, obviously, most people would like to have that kind of professional care, but, you know, even for the people who want to kind of avoid the medical system and its inflated costs, like very often the process of trying to bring someone in home, even like a midwife or like a doula, can be a very expensive ordeal in itself. So it's like even these people who are trying to opt out of the system still can't say it's a cost-free decision. Now, mind you, I think it is fair to say that if you are planning to have a kid come into this world, you should be to some degree prepared financially to be able to support them. But a lot of these costs are very cumbersome at the very beginning of life, and there's not a lot of support that's provided along the way to make sure that we're still taking care of kids and that parents can afford them. But we do agree with that general statement that if you're planning to have kids, you should feel financially prepared to take care of them.
Yeah, I mean, I saw Scott Santon's post a tweet about. I don't know that we should just expect everyone who's ever going to have kids to like have $1 million in their savings account. America puts an incredibly huge burden on its parents, um like even before a kid is born, just like prenatal care. A lot of other countries do so much more for their people, and I think our anyway, I'm not going to speculate because you have more data about like how much taxes are actually, but we still pay a lot of taxes for what we get in return, is what I'm trying to say. And we also subsidize a lot of these companies and insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies, for them to just essentially gouge us. So there was a study done a while back, that was trying to figure out where prices were coming from, and like essentially in American medical institutions, and essentially it was just what patients were willing to pay. So you would have a hospital right next door to another one, just like with completely different fee schedules. And this is something in other countries there are fixed rates. So an MRI in Japan costs $98, period, the end. It's an MRI, it's a standardized procedure. You cannot charge more for this standardized procedure. But in this country, we don't do price fixes. And so a hospital can charge $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, depending on like the added, feel. Like if you go to an expensive hospital, they're going to charge you more because of the luxuries and the amenities and stuff. But in actuality, these procedures are the same procedures anywhere you go. So this
Yeah,
and the cost of, I'm sorry, real quick, the cost again, like of having a kid either at home or in hospital is, again, so dependent on if you have a good job and good insurance. Because the difference between someone working at a law firm and their benefit package versus someone working at a fast food restaurant or a mom waitressing at Waffle House, the cost of her having a kid is going to be completely astronomically different than someone with a really great benefits package with a college degree and in a good city and all that stuff. I mean, it's so dependent on where you are, who you are. It's so unequal still. The disparities between how rich people and poor people live, their trajectories from even before day one. Like a well-off or comfortable middle-class child is going to have such a better start at life, even like nutrition-wise.
Yeah, and there's a variety of factors that kind of contribute to that. But the point that you brought up before that I really wanted to opine on was that some people might say, hey, why should we do these price fixings? What we need to do is bring this transparency and let people choose between the prices they see at different competitors who can offer the lowest price. Well, guess what? That doesn't exactly work exactly great with healthcare services, especially services that are often considered an emergency. You often are going to not have this degree of choice that you imagine, that you're suddenly in an emergency and you can suddenly start your process of price comparison on your phone or
Right.
whatever electronic device. You're rushing to a hospital and you're going to go to the nearest one to you. And you're going to take the prices of whatever they're charging you because you're in an emergency.
And the
So
ambulance.
this exactly, and if you require an ambulance service,
Forget
good
about
luck,
it.
because the prices
Yeah.
just got several $1,000s more expensive for that simple trip, and that's a really poor problem where people are not utilizing our emergency services when they need them because there's a price barrier to them. But the next part of life that I really wanted to emphasize, like, we finished the development of having them come out. We've done all the prenatal care. Now the process of actually taking care of a child. Once you've brought them into the world, you've made that choice. It's expensive. And
Mm.
so, just as a baby, that kind of process you just finished up, and you're bringing them home. Well, you clearly had to prepare a place to
Mhm.
hold them, and this kind of nursery can be largely expensive because it's not exactly overlapping goods that you usually already possess. Maybe if it's not your first child, you may have this stuff already. But for that first child,
Mhm.
the average nursery costs roughly $2,000 in average. So that's another cost. So you've now had that hospital cost of around 7,540. God forbid you take the ambulance there. Now you're approaching over 10,000. Add on the cost of nursery, and you now have your baby taken home and cared for, hopefully at around 12K in cost. And a lot of Americans don't have that saved up. And for a lot of people, it's like, okay, I don't have this cost, so I'm gonna have to get myself back to work immediately because I don't have paid time off, unlike so many other countries on earth.
Mhm.
So, Jackie, can you talk a little bit about why America is such an outlier compared to the rest of the world when it comes to this period of time just after recovering from childbirth?
Yeah, so you mentioned before the OECD. I'm gonna expand. That's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So that's an organization with 38 member countries, founded in 1961 to stimulate economic progress and world trade. So when we talk about America compared to the rest of the world, we're talking about these OECD nations. And of
Yeah, like
all of the
developed nations.
right of these nations, America is the only one that lacks mandatory paid paternity leave. Um, Compensation between 26% and 100%, with an average of 77%. So when we talk about paid paternity or maternity leave, normally it's not 100% of your paycheck. It's usually somewhere in between, from the low end of 26 to the high end of 100%. 15 of the 40 nations with paid leave do compensate all the way up to 100%. So when we talk about America having so much work to do, like we don't even get, 26% of, the average of 77. So leave for fathers included in 34 of the 40 states. We talk about the family unit, and people talk about, the Conservative Party loves to talk about family values. If we value the family, we should pay them to stay home with their children at least the first couple months, because we know the research shows how important it is to build those bonds, to have that support network for mom and dad and baby. Like it really does take a village. And I think it's so weird that like Hillary Clinton was skewered for saying that. Like, it is our responsibility as a society to contribute so that we feel like, so that we know, like, all of our citizens, all of our fellow Americans can start off on a good foot. We're leaving so many people behind. So different countries have it differently. Paid Medical Leave Act in America of 1993 provides 12 weeks, but only for companies with 50 or more employees. Think of how many millions of Americans are left out of the Paid Medical Leave Act because they don't work. Because, as we'll learn in our small business coming up next month, the vast majority of American businesses are small business. So 12 weeks paid leave died in the Senate in 2018. So maybe that's something that that is absolutely something that is part of our universal basics platform is. So like maybe we need to start focusing on that as well, but Medicare first, right? And then like UBI.
Yeah, there's a lot of different priorities we'd love to get across, but to your general point, it is abominable in my opinion that we are one of, I think, only two nations on all of Earth to not have any paid family leave program. Not just of OECD nations, we're like an outlier compared to the whole world, and to have so many of our allied nations basically be able to provide even compensation at 100%, not just for mom, but including of the father. I think that really shows you how far we're behind, and that we made only this requirement for large companies, which are such a small percentage of the total nation. Like, here's some great examples of a couple nations that really go far on this. They really believe in having this time together. For example, the highest amount of time is in Estonia. Mothers can take 20 of full paid maternity leave, followed by 62 weeks of the maximum paid parental leave. So they basically have a little bit of a distinguishing rate for maternity versus parental leave, but they give 82 weeks of parental leave in total. And then you have even countries that go further, not just like an option of like saying, hey, you need to you have an option to take time after you've had a pregnancy if you want to. Some countries actually say you got to do this mandatory, and you have to actually do it not just after the pregnancy has already been delivered, but a little bit beforehand too. For instance, in Chile, mothers are required to take a leave for a number of weeks before their due date. Mothers are required to take 6 weeks before births and 12 weeks after. In Austria, mothers are obligated to take 8 weeks before the birth, as well as 8 weeks afterwards. So there's a lot of nations who have recognized that it's not just something that should be made as a choice and made available. Maybe we should be basically incentivizing that or even enforcing that. We need to get these people to not feel so pressured to get right back into that grind and be away from their child, because as we're going to talk about so soon, it's really important for that time, that socialization, that development of language skill, that people be in the home around their kids. So
Yeah, in
I really
contrast,
do emphasize we are in an oddity in terms of
yeah,
the global stage on this.
yeah, contrast those mandated breaks before and after birth with a news that was recently in the headlines about an Amazon worker who pleaded with her managers and the Amazon to give her lighter duty while pregnant and was refused, and she ended up miscarrying. So
Yeah.
we have this obsession with, workism in this country, but I don't know that working our mothers into the ground is a great idea. Like, we talk a lot about caring about the kids, but and when it comes to actually the actions behind, the taglines, it's a completely different story. So I just ask, I would love for people to just be a little more discerning regarding, you know, uh, political campaigning slogans and what politicians actually do once they get in office.
Yeah, and even if it doesn't go to that point of a miscarriage, you have to imagine all that stress that often these kids are being put under during development, while mothers are very often feeling this need to have to be working up until the very day they deliver. And that, in my opinion, probably if studied, would have some adverse effect. We know in general the stress can have an impact on development within the womb. So
Yep.
I imagine that stress at the very end still working, it probably is contributing negatively. So I'd love to see more studies on that. But, I want to kind of go to the next point in life. So, we've talked about the period of time immediately after and getting your home set up, taking potentially leave from work. And, eventually over time, even in these countries that do provide paid medical leave, there's still this question eventually that a lot of parents face, which is, well, do you go back to work eventually, or do you stay home with the child in either most often one parent taking care of that role primarily? It's very rare that it's kind of switching off. So I wanted to ask you, Jackie, what are your sentiments about that conundrum that many parents face of, do I have one of us stay home with the child versus working? We obviously know in that single parent situation we were talking about beforehand, that's often not an available choice. They have to
Mhm.
work. But for the families that do have that choice, what do you think are some of the considerations that they have to think about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to keep bringing this home, but again, some people have the means, like you said, to be stay-at-home parents, and other people's never get that choice. So a lot of women that I personally know that had kids had to go back to work like almost immediately. Um, and a lot of times it's kind of this weird vicious cycle where parents need to go back to work to pay for childcare. So that's like a whole nother can of worms. Is like, again, America's one of the very few developed nations that don't have universal childcare. So we're essentially forcing parents back into work so that they can pay for childcare. It's very, very like perverted and perverse. So but this is another reason why we personally didn't have kids, is because I always said, like, if we were going to have kids, I would definitely want to stay home with them, possibly even homeschool. But studies show, number one, two-parent households, uh, children go so much further and have less behavioral problems. You're less likely to, have a teen pregnancy if you have two parents in the home. Just all kinds of stuff. Like if you have a two-parent household, which you're almost automatically on like you already have like a leg up, and um, so again, it's like, do you have the means to stay home or not? Like some people don't have that choice. So, but for those who can, kids who have both a stay-at-home parent, be it a mom or dad, they have increased school performance. They have less stress and are less aggressive, like social approval of stay-at-home. So a lot of people think it's kind of admirable for parents to choose to stay home. But there's also like, some people, that's not like their entire identity. Some parents want careers. So again, it's like not about shame, it's totally personal choice. So I'm not like, saying, oh, by going back to school, like you did your kid wrong. Not at all, not at all. You can still provide a nurturing, robust, safe home, then that's what really matters. But so some parents want to have a career, they want to go back to work. Stay-at-home moms, conversely, the kids might not have as much stress, but the moms, the stay-at-home parents may have some stress, some anger, a little resentment. But I feel like that almost goes back to, did they have a choice in the matter? Like when it comes to family planning, I don't know that 100% of the time people really, really do want to go into this endeavor, because it is, I mean, when you talk about responsibility, it's the responsibility to end all responsibilities. Like there's no getting out of it. I mean, there is for some, but for the most part, if you're like a responsible human being, you're going to stick with it. So there's sometimes, and I have had friends who've confided in me that they kind of wish they hadn't had kids, looking back on it. So, and that's human. It's totally like okay to feel that way too, but as long as you follow through with your obligations. There's a lot of social isolation for stay-at-home parents because they're not getting that work socialization, and they're almost always just spending time with kids. So
Yeah.
that's where those like mommy groups come in that are really helpful and stuff like that. So there are pros and cons. I think it's probably way more beneficial for the kid, than for the parent. But when you're a parent, that's what it's about. It's doing what's best for the kid. You're kind of like the back seat. You take second priority or you should at least. And if that's not your mindset, then again, maybe consider not being a parent. If you don't realize that it's not about you anymore once you have kids. And again, like, I just wish people were a little more honest. Like, I have seen people, I posted on Twitter earlier this week, like, do you ever hang out with a friend and just be like, wow, that person's a parent? Like, I know people that are just like, so should not have done that, and they'll be the first to admit it, like, oh my God, I'm such an idiot, So, I just wish people put more thought into it. You're bringing an entirely new human being onto this planet, and there's some major shit going on in this planet, y'all. Like, we got global climate change. We have like, in just this list that we're talking about right now, Americans are so at a disadvantage compared to other developed nations. We have to think really hard about what the kind of country and world we're bringing children into. And like, I think this is like where I feel like parents should be at the forefront of activism and advocacy, because it's their children's future. I don't have kids. If I wanted to, I could check out and not give a shit, because I don't have progeny to, like, that are going to have to deal with the fallout of our choices right now. So parents, I'm sometimes I'm a little disappointed that parents aren't more vocal and angry as I am. Parents are the ones that created like the Green New Deal and like what's the word? The EPA. Because of parents, because of activism of parents, the EPA was created, because like the Hudson River was on fire and kids were like, like right now in Detroit, they still don't have lead-free water. And for any parent that isn't upset that there are children who don't have lead-free water, like, shame on you. I'm sorry. Sometimes I'm a little annoyed that parents aren't as active and vocal. But I understand, like, oh, you have a lot going on. You have to make a living. You have to survive and help your kids survive. But what are we surviving for?
Yeah. And I think about this too. There's a lot of interesting dynamics you brought up. And I think the first one to me is that kind of decision economically, do you stay home with your child or not? And it can vary a lot by how many kids you have in the home, of what decision you make, whether it be to get a nanny or bringing them to a childcare center. Because if you bring them to the childcare center, you often pay per kid. And the average cost of childcare right now can vary. Most over 50% of people pay on average more than 10K. But roughly, when you look at the current rates of weekly rates, it depends on how many weeks of childcare you need to demand as a family. But if you're to use them all 52 weeks in the year, you need to use them constantly because you're working. You're going to be ending up spending on average around 17K. And if you have multiple kids, that could be 34K. And so think about that. 17K is more than the federal minimum wage pays in a year. You'd be paying more if you were working that federal minimum wage on childcare than you'd be earning. And this, if you have multiple kids, is a large reason why it's actually a lot of the times you get pressured into staying home with the kids if you're poor compared to having it actually be a choice for the affluent. A lot of times the affluent are the ones who can afford the childcare and continue to work and are bringing in high incomes to then afford those costs so they can be out there. A lot of the times poor people have less access to childcare options in their nearby vicinities. Roughly 19% of people who are earning below $50,000 say they don't have any access to nearby childcare for their kids, and that pressures a lot of them to have to stay home. Likewise, I can imagine you understand this dynamic living more in a rural area than myself. A lot of rural people lack access to basic childcare services in their area. And frankly, this is in my mind one of the reasons why proposals like universal childcare tend to be a little bit confusing because they can be a bit vague in how they're delivered. Because if you think about it in a rural area, where you're kind of more sparsely surrounded by other people, it's harder to put centralized services of where to drop off a kid. And so I'm not saying that it's impossible, but I think sometimes people need a little bit more of a definition of what does universal childcare mean? Is it 24/7? What are those boundaries of what it means? And so I generally think some of the things that we've been doing already to try and address the economic cost to allow parents to make the choices for themselves of what they need, like the child tax credit or extending after school programs, probably is the best stopgap compared to saying, let's put a daycare center everywhere. But I'm curious, Jackie, what in your mind do you envision when you talk about universal childcare? What does that mean to yourself?
I mean, it can take many different forms. It could be like the child tax credit that's happening right now, where we say, okay, the average. I mean, I'm not a policy person by any means, but we could either pay people just outright money, like to go to childcare, or I mean, I don't know how far Americans are willing to go with like government run childcare facilities. Like, is that going to raise red flags with some conspiracy people like, oh, they're going to put your kids, but like, I don't know, when you look at some of the childcare facilities that are, that like it comes to light that there's problems. I don't know. I mean,
This is why I generally
yeah.
like the idea of child tax credit and
Mhm.
extensions of after school programs, because I think about it this way. It's giving the parents that choice of what do they want to do with their kids. For the parents who do want to be a stay-at-home parent, they're not going to gain as much value out of a daycare center as the parent who chooses to go work. And I think that idea of saying, hey, if you have costs that you need help supporting from being a stay-at-home parent, you can also have that supported by the child tax credit. But if you want to go get childcare services with that tax credit, go right ahead. As well as these natural extensions of the schooling system, which are already providing some form of childcare. And I think this has become a big priority for a lot of people this past year because they finally recognized how big of a role the education system played in providing childcare services. And so when that got disrupted from people needing to be brought home and doing more remote education, a lot of parents started to be like, oh, I took for granted childcare. I guess
Mm.
I have to do this service now, and that's going to disrupt me during work, or I'm going to have to start paying someone to do childcare services for us. So
Mm.
it's in my opinion that under normal conditions, schools will normally be open. And I think that would be the best extension of saying, hey, we're not just providing childcare, but we're providing a nurturing environment that's educating these kids. But Jackie, I think the last thing that I really wanted to talk about was that first thing that you mentioned, which is just this complete disparity in America based off of economic condition. And talk about what are some of the supports that we give to families and children that are in poverty. Could you relay for us some of the programs that we currently administer to support families? We obviously already talked about the new child tax credit, this $3,600 per year, $300 per month that has been offered, this means tested program that Joe Biden recently rolled out. But what do we have going on as support systems before that child tax credit came?
Sure. So some of the benefits for children in poverty include WIC, the Women, Infant, and Children's Program. That average benefit gives about $61.24 a month, and the cost was $42. Does that mean that's how much it costs to administer it?
Yeah, exactly. So it is a good investment in that it's giving out a benefit of $61.24 a month, but it's only costing the government $42.07 to actually administer due to some discounts that it gets in some of the goods that it ends up providing to women in need.
And then there's TANF, that's a temporary assistance for needy families. That, let's see, only 20, that's $447 a month. Only 23% of eligible individuals for TANF get it, in which that's down from 68% in 1996. So 3.1 million extra people would be getting cash assistance if we were still at 1996 levels. This drop is due to state and local restrictions, mostly, of course, done by Republicans, and underfunding of administration to process applications. So just to interject real quick, there's an incredible book called The Wrecking Crew, and I think it's Thomas Friedman. I could be wrong. And they talk about how Republicans will get into office. Thomas Frank. They talk about the government not working, but I love Anand Giridharadas talks about that there are thousands of departments of the government that are working seamlessly that we take for granted every single solitary day of the week. But so the government works. We have roads, we have buildings that are still standing because of government regulation. So government works, and there are thousands of departments that are constantly servicing and keeping this whole 300 million citizens experiment going. So Republicans like to say government doesn't work, and then they get into office and they prove it, right? That's like a joke. So they will defund, defang. Donald Trump bragged that he rolled back more regulations than any other president in history, one or two term. This is what we're talking about. When Republicans get into office, they want small taxes and small governments, and that means your kids don't get as much money. You don't get as much assistance for when you need it. So I want people to understand when they're talking about small government and small taxes, they're also talking about small services, non-existent services. They're also talking about leaving children and grandparents to just, wither and wane, because taxes are tyranny and theft, So 41% of the nation's Black children live in states with TPRs, TANF to poverty ratios, or 10 or less, compared to 33% of Latino children and only 28% of white children. So, John, can you please expand on what those statistics mean?
So basically, this is, again, it's not just when you were mentioning small government programs are providing less benefit. It's also very often when you have these means tested programs where they have to do all these levels of administration, as well as all these different checks to make sure whether or not you're allowed to get it, it ends up meaning that certain groups of people can have kind of discrimination baked into the system by simply localities choosing how much restriction they want to administer over these programs. So, what this statistic is telling you is the percent of people who are eligible for the program who end up getting said program essentially. And so basically, in these groups of the country that it basically has standardized for poverty, it's saying Black communities are getting onto these programs with less reliability. Only 10% basically are getting onto these programs because they're making them so restrictive and they're underfunding the administration in those areas, so people aren't getting on. And it's basically saying compared to Latino children, that's at 33%, and for white children, it's at 28%. So it's very much these efforts, as you've heard here, are largely targeted against the Black community, very specifically. And these are communities that often, as we described before, they need some level of help because, as we mentioned, the single parent rate is significantly higher among the Black community. And now there can be a variety of reasons for that. Economics is one. There can be cultural dynamics, what
We
have you.
also need
We're not going to go into all the different dynamics,
yeah,
but
but the
this is
prison
clearly
industrial
something where there is
complex,
more help there.
yeah, I think
Oh, yeah, you mentioned the prison industrial complex. That's a great
yeah,
reasoning for
so
why these
yes,
families are so disrupted very
yes,
often as well.
yeah,
But
which is
this is
also systemic.
it is.
Yeah,
So, I think this is largely the key theme of today's episode is having kids comes with a cost. The system is radically different between poor America and non-poor America. We're not even saying rich America, just
yeah,
non-poor
exactly.
America. And I think we need to be fixing these systems so that A, they're more universal in that people aren't having to go through all these hoops to try and get the assistance so you don't have all this level of discrimination and trying to help families that are in poverty. That we should be empowering families to be able to make their own choices of how they want to raise their kids and whether or not they want to be a stay-at-home parent versus going out into the workforce. That should be a choice that they feel empowered to make. And that we should be catching up with the rest of the goddamn world when it comes to things like healthcare and paid leave.
Mm-hmm.
We are far behind. It's not just that we are far behind our developed nations and main competitors. It's the whole damn world that we're falling behind
Yep.
now on these subjects. And so I truly think those are my takeaways from today's episode. Jackie, did you have any final thoughts that you wanted to share on the subject of childcare?
We didn't even get into the topics of, homeschooling versus public school versus private school versus, school choice. We didn't talk about children with different needs. I personally, was like super ADHD growing up, and my childhood experience was probably a lot different than a lot of other people. We didn't talk about our home life, so this is something that, God bless her, I love Marianne Williamson so much. She talks about, how we're failing kids, and a lot of again, it comes back to, I'm always going to talk about being financially, spiritually, physically, emotionally ready to have kids. And this is going to be a hot take or possibly controversial, but I personally believe we have so much problems in this country, gun wise and just like random acts of violence, whatever, because so many people that are not whole themselves are reproducing and creating children and putting them in not so really good, nurturing, safe, conducive to having a good life environment. So we haven't even talked about home environments. We haven't talked about the really terrible things that happen to children who, even in our foster systems, I mean, even the people that are supposed to protect children are failing them so much. So, I mean, this is a subject that we could probably just talk on and on about. And
It's so
again, it's
true.
one of the reasons why we chose not to have kids, because I didn't feel like I personally could provide for them 100% what is absolutely needed. And that's a tough call. I think it's a little selfish to have kids just because you want them. You know, like we need
Yeah.
to really, really do right by our kids. And I see too much in this nation that is indicating that we're not doing right by our kids. I mean, just global climate change in and of itself, that we haven't tackled global climate change, to me says we're failing kids. Like, forget healthcare, forget everything else. If we don't have air to breathe and water to drink, then we've failed, and we're heading that direction. So, you know, it's a very, like, I'm very passionate about this subject. I have helped raise children. I was a professional, you know, babysitter, and I have lots and lots of nephews and nieces. I have 3 god kids. It's not that I don't like kids. I love kids. I want kids to have a great life. I didn't have a great life. I knew what it was like to be poor and to be raised in a not so conducive and safe and nurturing environment. And I wouldn't want anyone to go through that. This is why I'm a huge UBI advocate, because there are mothers and children right now that are suffering, that we could snap our fingers and change their entire trajectory of their life course if we just said, poor people, like, even if we means tested it to poor people and just gave everyone under the poverty line as like unconditional basic income, I would be happy with that, because it would change so many lives. But there are a lot of 2-parent households that are struggling too, but they have the income that puts them above. So means testing in itself, you know, we're not fans. So
Yeah.
yeah, I could go on and on.
Yeah. And, you know, there's 2 of those points that you brought up that I think are really good that you made sure to mention, which is one, for me personally, children with different needs is a big topic for myself, being as one of them myself. I'm on the autism spectrum. And when I was growing up, I was very lucky to have early intervention and was able to be one of those people who blessedly was not in a poor family. And so I was able to get the speech therapy that I needed to be able to be in front of most people and most not suspect that I had those issues growing up. But, you know, until the age of 6, I could not speak in full sentences to any degree. And I was very lucky to have that support system to kind of get the needs that I had. And that my
Yeah.
parents had solid jobs, so they had the insurance to get that early intervention to know that I had autism. That was very big. And the other one is that you brought up is the foster care system. I think it's absolutely right that people should be challenging whether or not they want to be bringing kids into this world, because there are so many kids that are already out there who are in need of love that we are just currently leaving out there on their own. There's roughly 400,000 kids in total in foster care, of which you have roughly 120,000 who are currently up for adoption right now, and are hoping to have a loving home that they can go to. And I think this is vitally important that we actually focus on properly funding these systems, and often trying to avoid separating kids from their families that put them in the foster care system in the first place. Like, very
Which
often
is
it's just
poverty
causes
as
of
well.
poverty that ends up separating them. There was a study that basically concluded that in 2017, 10% of family separation cases were just due to housing insufficiency. So basic poverty was causing people to be separated from their kids.
Yep.
And I think about this again from a very personal light. My father was an orphaned child and was very lucky himself to find a very loving home. And I really wonder what my life would have been like had he not been born, or if he had not found a loving home. But, you know, they decided to have the child. He was taken care of in a foster system, and luckily at a very young age, he was adopted. And God bless, he had a lucky life because of that. But there are so
Yeah.
many kids who are going without that home, and I'd love for them to get better treatment. And I'm loving to see some of the programs that we're seeing in like California, who are doing
Yes.
targeted basic income programs for people who are exiting the foster care system. So
Yeah.
I'm very glad that you got to bring that up as a final point as we wrap up today's episode on childcare. So that being said, that'll do it for us universal people. We hope you enjoyed today's People's Podcast on the People's Basics. We just want to remind you all, please do support the network by subscribing, liking / rating this podcast, depending on which platform you're listening to this on. And join us on our Discord by clicking the links that you're going to find in the description section. Jackie, do you want to let the folks out there know what we got coming up for the future weeks?
Yep. As you all know, every month we do a deep dive into one of the universal basic topics. And next month we're going to be talking about labor and small business in August. Please also check out our previous content on childcare, also linked in the description section. Everything that we've done this month and prior. Thanks for watching and supporting the home of the universal basics. See you next week.